Usually, when I do these videos, I'm talking about big international negotiations and treaties and world events like Brexit and trade deals and so on. But this time, I'm going to talk about something different, which I think is equally interesting. It's a great time to talk about this topic. And this is about the power of collective bargaining. And collective bargaining has been a well-known concept for a long time. But actually, in recent years, it's been very much in decline, and there's a whole host of reasons for it. But now I think we're seeing a resurgence. So let's have a little look at this. The first bit of interesting news is that a new General Secretary has been elected to head up the Unite Union. Now, this is very interesting, not just because it is a woman elected into the role, which is great to see in something that is a traditionally very male-dominated occupation, but I think she's deliberately gone down a very specific strategy, and her strategy is to get away from the big, high-profile political arena and get down to working level politicking. And this is politicking. Negotiation is all about, politics is negotiation in many ways. Politicians do not succeed by just telling people what to do. They succeed because they persuade people that a chosen course of action is the right thing to do. And that requires negotiation skills. And unions themselves are an extension of that, except they're working on numbers basis. They have lots of members, and they are trying to persuade all those members to pull in a particular direction, and are trying to get employers and politicians and so on to agree with whatever themes they're trying to put forward. So unions themselves are significant negotiation forces, potentially. So here we have a quote from Sharon Graham saying she intends to use that power as a negotiation force for the benefit of her members, while traditionally that power has been used to influence Labour leadership, and that was the strategy adopted by the previous General Secretary, Len McCluskey. Sharon Graham is going to do something different, and now is a great time to do that, actually. So she is talking about the fact that she will be on the picket lines with her members. And there was an interesting reveal. This is why she said she was not going to be attending the Labour conference. Very symbolic in a way of this shift in strategy. But there was an interesting reveal that the Unite Union alone has more than 20 ongoing industrial disputes. And that is very interesting, right in the middle of a time of significant shortages. And it's been made in the media and other areas that during a shortage, especially a labour shortage, it's a great time to try and negotiate for things like better conditions and improved pay. And in fact, the situation has got so hilarious that even Conservative ministers are openly suggesting that this is what people should do, which I have to admit is somewhat comical. The thought of Conservative ministers being in favour of collective bargaining carried out by unions is a bit of a first for me. I have to admit I've never seen such a thing, but Grant Shapps has been on TV making that exact point. Do we believe he suddenly bought into the theme of collective bargaining? I would suggest not. There's probably more trying to cover up the fact that he has failed abysmally to tackle a whole variety of problems, and he's trying to pretend that this was almost deliberate or almost intentional. But regardless, he is correct. Now is a great time to be engaging in collective bargaining. So let's have a little look about some of the basics, and I'm sure there'll be various union members that can give a far better description of this, far better explanation than I do. But we'll focus on some basic things that you need to make collective bargaining successful. First is numbers. As a union, they want numbers. They want lots of members. That is a force in itself. if you've got a high number of people, you gain more power as a consequence of that, just by the numbers. If you're able as well to make sure those numbers agree with everything you say, then that gives you a coherent voice. And that is important when it comes to collective bargaining, because whoever you're negotiating with must hear almost one perspective, must hear one message, if you like, coming across to them. If they hear or feel that there's division, that their people are not in agreement on the other side, then they will try to exploit that. So this is the other powerful advantage of collective bargaining, that is the means by which you can prevent divide and conquer tactics. So let's imagine you're working somewhere, and you go to your bosses or the senior leadership of the organization and you say, well, I feel I deserve a pay rise. You as a lonely individual would just be laughed out. There'll be nothing they can do. Or if you do genuinely have certain power, then they may offer you a bit of a pay rise and you may walk away satisfied until you find out that another colleague who bargained that little bit harder got even more of a pay rise than you did. So management of companies will quite happily negotiate on an individual basis in those sorts of scenarios, because that gives them more ability to use their advantages as managers to try and drive harder bargains, where those who are better or more successful negotiators will be the ones to succeed. But the whole purpose of a union, in many ways, of course, is to eliminate that, so that everyone equally, perhaps, derive the benefits of their negotiation. But this is all about power, the ability to apply leverage. And the ability of the union to apply leverage has been very limited in recent years. To general rule, they have to call a ballot, they have to get the views of the members, they have to follow the rules, then they can call a strike, and it's all very cumbersome, and deliberately so. That is designed to curtail their power. And of course, if they do go on strike, then it is quite often their members who are getting hurt, because their members don't get paid for that time when they're on strike. And if the organization that they're striking against can afford to bear that loss, well, those individuals still have bills to pay, mortgages to pay. There's only so long that they can sustain that strike. Possibly, they cannot sustain it longer than the company can sustain the losses. So you don't tend to have much in the way of genuine viable threats that the union can make outside of the strike. But now we're in a different territory. We're in a world of shortages, shortages of drivers, shortages of staff, shortages on the shelves. So the threat can be more viable now. Strikes can hurt more. In fact, you don't even need to strike at all to make even more effective threats. And I'll come on to that in a bit. What it does mean in the current situation is that the unions and their members have genuine walkout options. Because in an economy, in a market where the employer has the advantage and fine, they can get rid of that many, unionized minimum wage workforce and relatively quickly recruit new people, then it's very hard to leverage even the numbers towards your advantage. But if you know that those employers cannot do that, they just cannot find a workforce, then the priority has to shift for them. The employer now needs to focus on retaining what they have, not losing it and replacing it. So that means that the unions and their members have genuine walkout options. They don't have to walk out and strike. They can walk out into other jobs, other areas who are desperate for more workers. So let's explore this theme and let's do some role play. I like doing role play. Role play is a great way to teach people how to negotiate in a safe environment and how to explore a variety of themes. So in this scenario that I thought up, we've got the union. Union representing drivers in particular, shall we say. And let's say this union represents drivers working at Sainsbury's, a big Sainsbury's distribution depot. And for the sake of this scenario, Let us say, because this does frequently happen, that this Sainsbury's depot is based in a large industrial park, and just over the road is the Tesco distribution depot. Because quite often they will use very similar industrial park because it's cheap and there's lots of space and they're designed for that. So for the sake of this scenario, we're going to assume there's not much difference between a Tesco depot and a Sainsbury's depot. And in fact, they're very close to each other, so there's no big commuting difference. And we should also assume that working in depots of one is not hugely different in terms of systems, in terms of processes. So this union, in this scenario, can go to the Sainsbury's bosses and say, no, there's a general shortage, there's a particular shortage of drivers. There's a really acute shortage of heavy goods vehicle drivers. And that's important because heavy goods vehicle drivers have a high barrier to entry into the market. You can't just grab anyone and throw them into a heavy goods vehicle. They have to obtain special licenses and do lots of training, quite expensive training. So that gives them a lot of leverage. They're not easily replaceable. So the union goes to Sainsbury's and points all this out and says, let's have a pay rise. And let's say in this scenario, the bosses of Sainsbury's either say no or say, oh yeah, sure, we'll give you a pay rise, but just 1%. We're only going to give you 1%. And no matter what the union says, point out to the current shortages, point out to the fact that, Tesco is paying their staff more. Sainsbury's bosses said, no, tough luck. You work for us, you can't go anywhere. Obviously, you want a job, don't you? In this pandemic world. So you get 1%. So now the union's got some interesting options. They could ballot their members, and they could try and call a strike and slow and cumbersome and all that sort of thing. Or they could play more hardball. So those union representatives could walk over to Tesco, and let's say that both Sainsbury's and Tesco's are really struggling with staff shortages. They can barely meet the demand. Any drop whatsoever, and they're really, really in trouble. But the union members can walk over to Tesco, and they can say, well, we're quite angry with the Sainsbury's bosses. They won't give us an increase in pay. Do you want staff? Are you interested? And Tesco could say, yeah, actually, we took the decision we're going to pay our staff 20% more because we know we need to do that to keep them in this current market with all the shortages. So the union representatives could negotiate a fast-track entry process with Tesco. As I said, remember I said earlier that there's no substantial difference between working from one depot or another. And those members working in Sainsbury's can just as easily work in the Tesco's depot. So at this point, armed with this knowledge, armed with this sort of semi-deal, as it were, this proposal that Tesco will pay the Sainsbury's workers that move over 20% more and put them on the fast track so they don't have to sit around for ages waiting to join. They can just literally walk over the road, straight in, start work that next day. So the union members can go back to the Sainsbury's bosses and say, right, we've got their 20% pay offer. If you don't match it or exceed it, we're going to stick this on the notice board in all the staff rooms, in all the toilets, everywhere around this depot. We can tell those staff members, our union members, that they can walk across the road straight away and start with Tesco and get 20% paid more just for walking across the road. Now, Sainsbury's could be utterly insane and say, no, they're not doing it, you get 1% or nothing. And this is where the union has the viable threat. They can say, okay, fine. And they can literally do exactly what they said. Get those notices on the board, and before you know it, a whole host of staff have left Sainsbury's and walked over to Tesco. Now here's a crucial thing in these sort of negotiation dynamics. You want to be the first to take advantage of these deals. You don't want to be the last, necessarily. Because those who are left still working at Sainsbury's will find themselves having to deal with an even increasing workload, but they're not even getting the extra pay. So they're really losing out. Whereas those who immediately snapped up this offer and straight over walked over to Tesco, they're they're quids in, better conditions, better pay. So it pays to be fast off the mark here. Let's rewind a bit, and let's say, for example, Sainsbury's doesn't say no, says, oh damn, and said to the union, okay, we'll match the Tesco pay offer. This doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the matter. It could be. The union could say, right, we'll agree, straight away that happens. So straight away, Sainsbury's are matching Tesco. But the union can play a sneaky long game here. They could walk back over to Tesco and say, oh, well, Sainsbury's have just matched what you're about to offer. Any prospects of a better offer? And who knows? Tesco might even jack up the prices. Now, this could be an issue, because if Tesco are matching what they're paying their existing staff, then paying Sainsbury's staff to switch over a higher amount will cause them problems. So the union will need to recognise that. They'll recognise that there is a likely red line for Tesco, the do not exceed line, because that is what they're paying their current staff. But it is always possible that they can play these two off against each other and thus leverage that higher pay rise for their workers. They've got even more power if that same union represents Tesco workers as well as Sainsbury's. They can do quite a lot of back and forth. And so the end result is, in this sort of scenario, this bit of role play, that both Sainsbury's and Tesco will be forced to essentially increase the pay and probably match each other to retain their drivers, to retain their workforce. Now I imagine that although this is a role play scenario, this is something that probably is going to start happening across the country. If you've got all these depots that are very close to each other and these staff that want that extra pay, this is no doubt happening. And this is something I imagine the Unite Union is going to be looking very curiously at doing. They're going to be very intent on getting better deals for their members. Will they just stick to the old method of calling strikes, disputes, or will they recognise that they have more power in mobility and by actually moving people over to different areas, assuming that the staff, the people are mobile? Because if they do have that leverage, then their bargaining power has increased dramatically. So I hope you found this analysis useful. This is going to be very interesting to see how the unions do in the current climate, and I'm sure I will be talking about this topic again in the future. If you have any interesting insights or comments, then please do put them in the comment box below.